Well, as we sit here today, this Father's Day morning, there is a group of young people right now who are in the process of retracing Charles Darwin's historic 19th century sea voyage. And they're doing it in a 100-year-old tall ship. So they just left the Galapagos. I've been kind of keeping track of where they're at. And they're right now heading for Easter Island. And that would be amazing, would it not? I mean, set aside for the moment what you might believe about Darwinian evolution, can you imagine all the new sights and sounds you would experience? It would truly be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But as Darwin processed his observations from this famous expedition, he had to admit that his theory was far from airtight. There were some significant questions that he was not able to answer. And so scientists have been trying to solve these problems with varying degrees of success ever since. And one of those scientists was an American geneticist named George R. Price. And the life of George R. Price was complicated, as were his theories. And so fair warning, our opening illustration this morning is going to get a bit technical. It's going to be a little different than how we normally do things. It's going to take a little bit of time to untangle it. But bear with me because the payoff, I really think, is going to be worth it. Because George's story sets up today's passage perfectly. Okay? So George R. Price was born October 16th, 1922 in upstate New York. And he was a smart kid. He blew everyone away with his mathematical prowess. But his true love was science. And finding no rational argument for the existence of God, George became a militant, argumentative, proselytizing atheist. George enrolled in the University of Chicago, and while he was earning his doctorate during World War II, he was also secretly working for the government on the Manhattan Project. So George Price was doing big things in his professional life, but his personal life was eroding. George's wife, Julia, was a devout Roman Catholic, and she took their two daughters to church. But George couldn't hide his contempt for what he said was her irrational, unscientific Christian faith. So they divorced in 1955. And the turmoil in George's inner life was starting to boil over. He believed that he wasn't getting the recognition that he deserved from the United States government and from the American scientific institutions for which he worked. So eventually he quit his job, cut ties with everyone, and in 1967 he moved to Britain in hopes of making one great scientific discovery to really leave his mark. George was middle-aged, had no job, no money, no academic connections across the pond with anyone. It's kind of a low point in his life. But he still had one thing going for him. He was brilliant. And while living in poverty in London, he set his mind to solving one of evolutionary biology's biggest conundrums. It was a problem for which Darwin was never really able to answer. Why does altruism exist? Altruism is a philosophy that calls for doing good to others even at the expense of yourself. It's when an individual chooses to prioritize the group, the herd, the tribe, over his own safety and interests. Altruism is basically selflessness. And so how does that violate the rules of Darwinian evolution? Well, as you'll remember from 9th grade biology, evolution runs on the principle of survival of the fittest. In other words, individual organisms compete to survive and breed and pass down their genetic material to subsequent generations. Instinctively, that's the highest goal of every living thing, according to Darwinian evolution. And selflessness is beneficial for survival, right? So every inborn trait in an organism that leads to selfish tendencies, according to evolution, will survive and get passed down to its offspring, while any inherent instinct toward helping others at its own expense will eventually go extinct. Does that make sense? But if that's the case, then how do we still have altruism in our world? Natural selection would seem to predict that any tendency towards self-sacrifice would have been bred out of us a long time ago. But it's not just humans who demonstrate altruism. What really puzzled Darwin is how altruism can be seen in certain elements of the animal kingdom. Ants, for example, work together for the good of the nest, even to their own individual detriment. Sterile worker ants, who literally have zero chance of passing on their altruistic genes to the next generation, somehow continue to pop up generation after generation to sacrifice themselves for the queen. Birds will sometimes nurture abandoned babies from other nests, even though they have no genetic connection to them whatsoever. It's also been observed that individual monkeys will sometimes sacrifice themselves to warn the tribe of a predator. Evolutionary biology can easily explain why mama bears would instinctively sacrifice themselves for their cubs. They're trying to preserve their own genetic line. But what's the explanation for these altruistic sacrifices between genetically unrelated organisms? Why are there certain individuals, despite the laws of Darwinian self-preservation, who buck their genetic instincts and sacrifice their own well-being so that others could survive? Well, that's the question George Price put his mind toward answering. And answer it he did, he thought. George put forth the theory that altruistic genes in nature could get passed down and proliferate even among unrelated individuals when those altruistic individuals could help each other survive. And that's a gross oversimplification of his theory, but it makes sense in some ways because there's strength in numbers. If organisms work together, they're more likely to survive. So according to George's theory, altruism is simply disguised, indirect selfishness. Love, generosity, and sacrifice never come from some innate source of virtue in his mind. Instead, the best we can hope for is secondhand kindness. In other words, we instinctively give to others out of inherently selfish motives in order to eventually get something in return. So pure, unadulterated goodness is fiction. Now that's incredibly cynical, right? And the theory has its flaws for sure. Not all altruism, even in the animal kingdom, can be explained away by citing indirect, selfish motives. But George's equation was good enough for him to walk out of University College London with an honorary appointment, an office, and a job. George Price had clawed his way back to the top again. But then something strange happened. George found himself really bothered by his own theory. Without true goodness, what's the point of life if everything is based on indirectly selfish motives? And about that time, he had another revelation, but this one was religious. George has some sort of epiphany through which he became a disciple of Jesus' altruistic teaching. He didn't like to talk about this epiphany because he thought other scientists would make fun of him, but something happened to him. And so it's almost at that point he set out to disprove his own theory. Maybe pure, unadulterated goodness could exist, he thought. And so he became an altruist. He freely gave away his money to whomever asked. Freely, without any questions. He invited vagrants who had nowhere else to go to turn up and just come live with him. And inevitably, when they bled him dry financially, then he went and lived among them on the street. It was complete selflessness and altruism he was trying to do. But eventually, all this goodness took its toll on George's mental and physical health, and he wasn't treating his thyroid issue so he could help other people, among other things. And then tragically, on January 6, 1975, George R. Price committed suicide in a flop house in London. He was only 52 years old. If there was ever anyone who was literally killed by kindness, then it was George Price. What a tragic ending. Yet it's incredibly instructive for us. In some ways, the life of George Price seems ridiculous. What did he expect to happen when he started giving away everything at his own expense, right? What did he expect to happen when he tried to help everyone else regardless or without regard for his own physical and emotional health? Anyone who takes altruism to this extreme is eventually going to fall apart and die, and then he won't be any good for anyone. So ironically, George demonstrated with his life and death that altruism is unequivocally an evolutionary disaster. The herd will always destroy the altruistic individual eventually. And therefore, there is no evolutionary advantage to selflessness. But here's my question for everyone today, and I appreciate you bearing with me through that technical explanation. But here's the question that we have to answer from all of this. If love and kindness and compassion and empathy and generosity and all these, if they are so counterproductive to our supposed evolutionary drives and instincts, then why do we still have these things in our world? Because when you think about it, the fate of George Price should be the fate of all those who genuinely love people, rationally speaking. The lovers among us should be at the bottom of the heap in terms of evolutionary, Darwinian evolution. Jesus people should have gone extinct a long time ago, right? After all, Jesus himself was cut down in his prime, despite all the good he was able to do. Kindness should have killed all of us off. But history has proven otherwise. People are still compelled to follow the Jesus way after all these centuries. Even atheists seem to have a begrudging respect for the wisdom of Jesus. So maybe there's something greater at work in this world than genetics. Maybe we're beholden to something more than evolutionary instincts. I am not an advocate nor believer in Darwinian evolution, but I won't deny the intelligence of Charles Darwin. Truly, we look at our world and survival of the fittest seems to fit with how people operate, right? But what if there's a higher truth at play than this dog-eat-dog philosophy? What if the key to life and peace and joy and happiness is to rise above Darwin's observations about life? What if no matter what this world throws at us and no matter how many times it knocks us down, we tenaciously fight back with even more kindness? And what if, against all odds, we survive? Because that's exactly what we see in today's passage. So I'm going to encourage you to turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 40. If you don't have a Bible, please take out one of ours from the shelf underneath the pew in front of you, and you turn that to page 33. You will find Genesis 40. Or you can use your smartphone to scan the QR code on the worksheet in the bulletin, and you will find Genesis 40. We've all had dreams in life, right? But for many of us, those dreams have turned into nightmares. We slog through family dysfunction. We give into temptation. We struggle with forgiveness. We question God's goodness and his providence. Circumstances don't seem to go the way we need them to. But there's an epic story in the Old Testament of a man who lived through the same life nightmares as us, and he was dealt a tough hand, but he chased his dreams, and every once in a while he caught one of his dreams. And so this is Dreamcatcher, the falling and rising of Joseph. And so far we've seen Joseph of the Old Testament get betrayed by his dysfunctional family. His older brothers sold him into slavery due to their jealousy over his favored status with their father Jacob. And they let Jacob believe that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal while they sold him into slavery. And so Joseph was dragged down to Egypt by the slave traders, where he was purchased by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. But Joseph flourished in Potiphar's house. He worked hard, he earned Potiphar's trust, and became head of the household. Other than freedom, it was the best for which an ancient Egyptian slave could hope for. So Joseph clawed his way to the top of the heap. But then he was betrayed by Potiphar's wife, and he was wrongfully thrown into prison, and so Joseph just kept getting knocked down. So heading into today's passage, you would think that it'd be time to throw in the towel, right? You would think that it'd be time for Joseph to wallow in his despair, resentment, and self-loathing, sitting in that prison that he didn't deserve to be in. Evolutionary biology had finally caught up with him. His kindness would finally kill him. The strong, once again, had crushed the weak, and the selfish had taken advantage of the selfless. But there was a law at work in Joseph's life greater than natural selection. Joseph was not some mindless, soulless beast who is obligated to follow his instincts. Joseph was a man, and as such, he chose to rise above the natural laws of this world. And so let's pick up the story in Genesis chapter 40, verses 1 through 3. It says this: "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined." So it says sometime after this. So we get the impression that Joseph hadn't been sitting in prison for a few days. He had been there for a while. Maybe it had been years. And nothing in his circumstances gave him any indication that he would ever get out of this prison alive. Maybe as a slave in Egypt, there was at least a chance of having a happy life. Joseph had already proven that. But there were no happy prisoners in Egypt. Take, for example, the two high-profile inmates in today's passage. The royal cupbearer and the head baker of Pharaoh's court somehow offended their master and ended up in this pit. Now, we don't know exactly what happened, but I think it's safe to say they might have been accused of hatching some poisoning plot against Pharaoh. Ancient pharaohs were assassinated all the time. And in order to poison Pharaoh, the baker and the cupbearer would both need to be on board because the baker made the food and the cupbearer served the food. So they were both thrown into prison as Pharaoh investigated these accusations, apparently. And as you can imagine, they were both very troubled. Pharaohs were not known for their mercy, they were more known for their paranoia. But look at who was there for these two guys in their state of need. Picking up the story in verse 4. "The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled, so he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, 'Why are your faces downcast today?' And so, who was the captain of the guard? Well, it was Potiphar. Potiphar still wanted Joseph to manage his affairs, only now he was doing it from Potiphar's prison. So evidently, Joseph was still working hard despite his situation. His attitude had not changed. He hadn't gotten beat down by his circumstances. He was going to make the most of whatever opportunity he still had. So Potiphar ordered Joseph to look after these two guys. They were very important after all. And look what Joseph did. He attended to them. He ministered to them. He cared for them. He served them. He noticed when they were sad, and he asked them about it. He took the time to listen to them. And he offered words of comfort and encouragement. In other words, Joseph was altruistic. Instead of competing for limited resources of the prison and turning to cutthroat tactics, Joseph actually took care of these guys. He loved them and showed kindness to them. It may have been the survival of the fittest for everyone else in Egypt, but not in this prison. This prison was governed by a higher law, and that's remarkable. So the cupbearer felt comfortable enough around Joseph to put down his guard and tell him about his dream. And so let's look at this passage a little bit longer, but we need to read it all to get the picture of what's going on. So in verse 8, they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there was no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, so to get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. And here also I have done nothing that they should put me in the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Whew. Okay. Now remember, Joseph was on God's wavelength. So when God gave someone a dream, Joseph could interpret it. And he told these guys the truth. The cupbearer's dream foresaw Pharaoh restoring him to his place, but the baker's dream foresaw him being found guilty of conspiracy and being hanged. And just as Joseph predicted, it came to be. Now, since one of them restored and one was not, it's probably safe to assume that the cupbearer really was innocent and the baker really was guilty. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been this careful distinction. Pharaoh would have either spared them both or killed them both if he's acting on a whim. But this passage is the only place we ever see Joseph asking someone for help. He asked the cupbearer to mention him before Pharaoh. After all, men with the gift of dream interpretation were considered highly valuable in ancient times. Yet the chief cupbearer forgot about him. In fact, just to give you a sneak peek into the next chapter, look how long he forgot about Joseph. In Genesis 41:1, after 2 whole years. Think about what you're doing 2 years ago. I can't even remember what I was doing in 2022. That's how long Joseph was forgotten. Now, many of us know the end of the story. We know what's going to happen, but Joseph didn't. He had no idea how everything was going to work out. He only had his dreams to hold on to. So again, we see Joseph being betrayed. Again, he was let down by someone close to him. After climbing to the top of the heap, time and time again, whatever situation he found himself, he was left with disappointment. Everyone seemed to have been conspiring against him. Circumstances seemed to have been conspiring against him. And poor Joseph just couldn't catch a break. Yet here he is, still toiling away. He's still doing his best. His attitude is still good. He's happy. He's caring for people. He's showing kindness. He's living the Jesus life wherever he's at, no matter what. And he never considered his life to be ruined. Even if the story ended here, we don't get the sense that Joseph would fall into despair. As long as he could love people, then he had a purpose. And no one could ever take that joy away from him. So Joseph had taken everything that Darwinianism could throw at him. He had been knocked down time and time again despite his kindness. And like George Price, he could have let his circumstances kill him. But somehow, some way, Joseph persevered. And that's our main point from today's passage. In your bulletin, if you want to write it down, the main point is Joseph may have been down, but he refused to drown. Joseph may have been down, but he refused to drown. Despite one soul-crushing disappointment after another, Joseph still kept his head above water. Joseph still loved. Joseph still showed kindness. He served the people who were in the same situation as him, and he brightened their days. He never drowned in self-pity, sorrow, resentment, or anger. He kept his attitude and demeanor sunny. And Joseph, despite everything, still found a way to be happy. But he wasn't the only one. This impossible perseverance is found in the New Testament as well. Here's how the Apostle Paul described it. in 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He said, "We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed." And I would add down but not drown. But this is everything, folks. Wouldn't you want to be like this? Wouldn't this be the key to a good and happy life? No matter what happens, you're still okay. In fact, you're better than okay. No matter what the circumstances are in your life, you're happy. You're not laughing like a fool when bad things happen, but you are strong, peaceful, and productive nonetheless. And this is what separates Joseph from George Price that we talked about earlier. Despite their remarkable similarities in their circumstances, they both practice altruism in the face of ever-worsening circumstances. They both defied what their cutthroat, supposedly evolutionary instincts would have demanded. But while George Price was worn down, broken, and eventually destroyed and drowned by his altruism, as Darwin would have predicted, Joseph's love and kindness and generosity made him stronger. So it's very important for us to understand the distinction between the two, because like the Apostle Paul said, we don't want to be destroyed after getting struck down, right? And remember, in real time, Joseph couldn't read ahead in the story. All he knew what was happening to him in the moment, yet he did not drown. He did not give up and commit suicide as George Price did. So we're not going to sit back and we're not just going to sit back here and just admire Joseph for his perseverance. That would be easy to do in a sermon. We're going to figure out how he did it so we can do it. And we're going to find a better and more practical to this answer to this question of how he did it, rather than just like, well, just pray more. Just find more faith, Thanks, that helps a lot, doesn't it? So how did Joseph thumb his nose at Darwinian evolution even before it was a thing? How did he succeed where George Price failed? How did he overcome the laws that govern this world, survival of the fittest and so forth? Well, there are probably many reasons, and I don't want to oversimplify, but I will point out this. Despite being a born-again Christian, George Price never addressed the tension between his newfound faith and his firm scientific conviction that men are just genetic beasts. He never worked through that tension, ever. To him, man was just an animal who had no choice but to follow his basest instincts. Man was a genetically programmed machine. And as such, man couldn't break free from his imprinted selfish nature, no matter how hard he tried. So man was simply a victim of his environment, his instincts, and his hereditary makeup. And in the end, George Price felt he had no choice but to let his genetics win. His altruism lost the battle with what he considered to be his evolutionary destiny. Speaking of evolution, the year after our buddy George Price died, a young hotshot evolutionary biologist from Britain named Richard Dawkins came out with a book called The Selfish Gene. It was perhaps the most influential book on evolutionary theory since Darwin's The Origin of Species. Now, Price and Dawkins didn't know each other in their lifetime, but they drew from the same influences. And their theories about evolution were very much in line with one another. In his book, Darwin put forth the theory that our genes compel us to do whatever it takes to survive and replicate in our quest to become basically immortal. In other words, we are slaves to our genetic instincts to act in accordance with what's in their reproductive best interests. Hence, the selfish gene. And here's probably the most famous quote from Dawkins's book, which he wrote in the preface of the first edition. He wrote, "We, people, men, are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." Folks, I think your peace and happiness and well-being hinge upon your response to this idea. Forget about whatever objections to evolutionary theory you might have for a moment. That's not the debate we're having today, okay? Because evolution is simply the vehicle I'm using to illustrate the point. The real question is this: are you able to defy your natural inclinations, or are you beholden to them? What do you believe about that? Are you merely a beast? Are you a slave? Are you a victim? Are you a robot? Are you a pre-programmed computer? Must you do what your genetics tell you to do? Must you do what this world system demands that you do? Must you act as your circumstances dictate? Must you respond to every situation in the future just as you have in the past? Must you follow your basest instincts? Or to couch it in theological terms, must you obey your flesh? Must you follow your sinful nature? Because I think the Apostle Paul talked about this. If you look at Romans chapter 7, he said this, "For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is my flesh, for I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out." Does that sound familiar? Now, Joseph probably didn't know much about his sinful nature. He certainly didn't know anything about genetics. But there was one thing that he did know. He knew that he was free. And this is ironic, since Joseph acknowledged in this passage that he was both a slave and a prisoner. You don't get much less free than that, right? But despite all that, he was freer than anyone else, because he knew he was not a beast, nor were his fellow prisoners, though I guarantee you slaves and prisoners back then were treated like beasts. He was a man, and therefore he could choose to treat other men with humanity. And that's a theme we've seen get repeated time and time again through this series. Joseph was a free agent. So no matter how bad his situation got, he didn't have to go along with whatever his circumstances would normally call for. He didn't need to do what everyone else would do. He didn't need to listen to his knee-jerk response. He was not a brute beast who was compelled to follow his instincts. He was a human, and humans have real choices. So Joseph chose to rise above evolution, genetics, his cutthroat society, this world system, and instead fully embrace his humanity, which was higher than all of that stuff. He threw off the shackles of this world's ruthless ways and instead chose kindness. And that's our application from today's passage. In your bulletin, the application is harness your humanness. Harness your humanness. It's the most powerful thing you have other than the Spirit of God in you. Folks, there is, and we forget this, right? But there is so much dignity in just being a human. But the greatest dignity of all is not being beholden to animal instincts or genetics or any world system. As a man or a woman, you are free to choose your own response. Nothing can interfere with your volition unless you allow it. Listen to what the Apostle Paul recognized in Ephesians chapter 4. He has said, "You have heard about him and were taught in him," talking about Christ, as the truth is in Jesus, to put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on a new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. As a human, you have been created in the likeness and image of God, not in the likeness and image of lower life forms. Therefore, you can choose to put off the old self, the sin nature, your instincts, your past, your circumstances, your genes, or whatever you want to call it, and you can be who you want to be. You can think and act and feel in a new way. You are not a product of evolutionary determinism. You are not. You do not need to follow your normal tendencies or do everything your body tells you to do. You are a slave to nothing, at least on the inside. You are absolutely free to be fully human, and no one can strip you of your humanity unless you allow them. In this series so far, we've talked about radically giving up control of the universe, right? We don't control any of these circumstances. We've talked about last week about radically giving up the control of other people, right? We'll be so much happier. We undermine our happiness by trying to control people and having all these expectations of them. But today, we're talking about radically embracing the absolute control we have over ourselves. Folks, I'm a firm believer in free will. God doesn't even touch your free will. He could, but he chooses not to. God could enslave us, but he decides to give us free choice. Look what he says in Deuteronomy 30. He says, God says, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live. So as a human, you can choose to rise above your misery, just as Joseph did. You can harness your humanity and rise above your patterns of behavior. You can choose to follow the power of the Holy Spirit of Jesus in you. You can choose that. You can choose to allow the Spirit of God to give you happiness, even in hopeless situations. You're not God, but you sure are made in his image. And like God, you can make free choices. You can absolutely refuse to be miserable. You can refuse. You can choose that. Harness your humanity. You can choose to treat every person with dignity, no matter what the situation. You can choose that. Christians get all messed up when they I just can't control myself. They think they're just like a robot of what God makes them or whatever their human nature says they need to be. They just, it's all God's sovereignty. Yes, I believe in God's sovereignty. But in God's sovereignty, he's given you free choice. You can choose. You can choose to follow the Spirit of God and live a different kind of life. So radically embrace what it means to be a human made in God's image. Rise above what the cutthroat philosophies of this world demand from you. You see, your overlords in this world want you to believe that you're incapable of thinking on your own, choosing for yourself, and being happy despite whatever miserable situation they force upon you. You know, they can destroy the economy, right? They're good at that. Shoot, they could confiscate your home. They could throw you in jail. But until they kill you, they can't keep you from being kind. That's how Joseph refused to drown despite being down. He harnessed his humanity. And while everyone else around him was living like beasts, he harnessed his humanity and all the free will that goes along with it. And he thrived. That is the key to the Jesus life. and to living a happy life despite whatever else in this world is going on. He harnessed his humanity and chose the Jesus life. So Joseph knew what it was like to live on the mountaintop. He also knew what it was like to live in the valley. But as we're going to see next week as we study Genesis 41, in order to accomplish all that Joseph did, he needed to be the same person both in the highs and in the lows. And that's hard, right? But we need to learn to do that. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, Genesis 41. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that this truth would just saturate our lives as we leave here today, as we go about our week. God, we tend to see ourselves as victims to whatever, the world system, our genetics, our sin nature, whatever our past is and whatever we think we need, however we need to respond or to our instincts. But Lord, we are made in your image. We are free. I thank you for that dignity you've bestowed upon us. The animals have no free will, but we are not animals. And so, Lord, I pray that we would exercise that humanity, that we would tap into the Spirit of God that only we have as humans within us, and that we would choose the Jesus life. We would rise above all these philosophies and choose joy and peace and Jesus over any misery and base instincts that other people think they need to follow. I pray we would rise above and we would find that happiness we're looking for. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.